Anthony Robbins once said, "To effectively communicate, we must realize that we're all different in the way we perceive the world, and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. The way I perceive the world and the way you perceive the world is entirely different." In our culture, there is a barrier between each generation in regards to miscommunication. When it comes to the parent and child dynamic, that barrier may cultivate resentment from both sides. Think about your relationship with your parent and child. Are you happy with that? If the answer is no, ask yourself, what can I do? Communication is fluid. There is no quick fix. It is active, conscious, and intentional. Each generation had an upbringing that is unique to them. Therefore, each generation has a mindset that is unique to them. Naturally, that uniqueness presents the struggle that is finding middle ground. Let's entertain multiple scenarios for miscommunication. Scenario 1. Relationships and friendships. Say you have a friend or a partner in life that your parents disapproves of, and you don't like that. On one hand, that disapproval exists for a reason. On the other hand, you have an emotional connection to that person. This is where miscommunication can begin. Because you have an emotional connection to that person, you may not want to hear what your parents have to say. Therefore, the only perspective you are focused on is your own. What do we do here? Despite having their best interests at heart, forcing the child to separate from the person you disapprove of would take away from the control they have over their own decisions, rendering them with a feeling of powerlessness. To avoid that, allow the child to maintain independence when making their own decisions and mistakes, even if it allows someone that you don't approve of. This will give the child the feeling that you trust them in making their own decisions, giving them a sense of responsibility. The miscommunication gives us the feeling that my parents don't get it. Many of us have experienced that. However, we also don't get it. In order to communicate successfully, we must understand our shortcomings first. Scenario 2. Studying. The miscommunication does not stop there. Parents and children may also miscommunicate when it comes to studying. For example, I joined the IB system 3 years ago, and I graduated this year. IB is not as popular here in Egypt, so whenever I mention it to anyone, I still get asked, "What is that?" IB includes diverse mediums of study, like movies. Sometimes I'd be watching a movie and I'd tell my parents that I'm studying and they wouldn't believe me. I was accused of not studying even though I was, just in a different way. I studied, just in a different way. Personally, I felt attacked because they made me feel like I did not do enough. In reality, the problem was they did not fully understand the system. This caused miscommunication as well as constant fights between us over whether or not I was studying the right way. Those fights made me feel like a disappointment and like I failed to meet their standards. They made me feel like a disappointment and like I failed to meet their standards. And then I realized that that's not how they wanted to make me feel. They just wanted what was best for me. The miscommunication is what escalated that. Scenario 3. The future. At one point in life, the child faces the choice that sets the course for the rest of their life. That being, college majors. However, that choice may be riddled with obstacles. Parents, like their children, also had to face the trial of trying to build the base for the coming decades of their life. They are only human after all. Naturally, parents don't want their children to make the same mistakes they've made in the past. Therefore, they try to bestow their wisdom in an attempt to guide them in a different direction. However, while it may be done in good faith, it may come off as restricting. Whether it regards success or failure, parents put for their children a set of guidelines on what to do and what not to do, based on their own experiences. This comes from their own scope of life. It is what they've learned, and it is what they know. While this may be helpful, it's important to take into account the fact that the child has been born into a different generation and a different environment. Therefore, they are not the same. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for another, and this does not exclude parents and children. You are not your child, and your child is not you. Scenario 4. Mental health. Different perceptions of mental health as well as its development may also be a victim of miscommunication between parents and child. In our community, mental health has a negative stigma. If one were to go to therapy, they would immediately be viewed as crazy and be rejected by the society. Although progress has been made regarding the perception of mental health now, there are still some complications when it's being addressed by an individual, especially with their parents. The stigma that mental health equates to being crazy is dismissive and harmful, not only to an individual, but to society at large. Now, where does this start? With your parents. A Ramadan series that aired this year, called خلي بالك من زيزي, starring Amina Khalil and Mohammed Mamdouh, presents scenarios of what it looks like when parents and children communicate in regards to mental health, as well as what it looks like when they don't. This series includes two characters, Zizi and Tito. They both had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As a child, Zizi was hyperactive and disruptive, and her parents did not understand why. Immediately, they assumed that she was a problem child, and they locked her up in a closet. As for Tito, she had problems in school, and her parents sought out the reason by communicating with her. She got diagnosed with ADHD, and she learned how to adjust to her environment as well as how to communicate with her parents. As an adult, Zizi had a rocky relationship with her parents and communicating, as well as anger issues. She did not understand why she couldn't adjust to her environment until she got diagnosed with ADHD. Only then was she able to understand her environment and how to adjust to it, as well as communicate with her parents, because she finally understood why she behaved the way she did. As for Tito, because she got diagnosed at a young age, she was already adjusted, and her life was organized and catered to her, because she and her parents communicated openly. Essentially, communication in regards to mental health is very important because its effect ripples into the future of the child and onto the next generation. It requires an open mind, acceptance, and a willingness to take action. Speaking of taking action, I have put together a guide on how to communicate effectively. This guide targets both parents and children. It includes a few steps on how it helps to understand each other better. A guide to miscommunication. How do we implement a system of communication in our lives? 1. Acknowledge the existence of the miscommunication. 2. Establish the desire to communicate. 3. Become aware of the source. How? If emotions are running high, pause the conversation and circle back later. Otherwise, your judgment may be compromised, and any of you could say something that they do not mean. When pausing the conversation, do not place blame. Pause on neutral ground. Recognize that each of you has something they want to say that is not being heard. This argument has a purpose. Decipher what it is. Make space for each other. Be a non-reactive listener. And then calmly address what you were told. Calmly address what you were told. It's important to ask yourself the question, in a couple of years, do you want to be proud and alone, or do you want a loving community? It is connection over correction. In return, when someone makes space for you, return that space back to avoid resentment. Communication is honest and vulnerable. Make it safe to be vulnerable. Recognize when you have made a mistake. Make it okay to make mistakes. Communication is a two-way street, and so is a healthy dynamic. I am not my parents, and my parents are not me. We have our similarities and our differences, and in order to understand each other, we put in great effort. That's not to say that we communicate perfectly and effectively all the time, but we recognize that we have different perspectives, and we work with what we have. You don't necessarily need a guide to communicate with your parents, child, or anyone for that matter. What you need is mutual respect and the will to understand each other. You need to become aware of your communicative blind spots and shine a light on it. Bring your differences into the light. To effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world, and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others.